The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the Capitol building as J.D. Vance adjusted his tie one final time. Today was different from all the others. Today, he would be meeting with representatives from the British royal family who had come to discuss a new trade agreement between the United States and the United Kingdom. The meeting was supposed to be a routine diplomatic affair, but Vance had other plans. As the newly appointed vice president, Vance felt the weight of his position more keenly than ever. He had risen from humble beginnings in Ohio, writing about his struggles in his famous memoir, and now he stood at the pinnacle of American power. But with that power came expectations, and Vance was determined to show that America would not bow to anyone, not even to centuries-old traditions of British royalty. The Royal Guard had arrived 3 days earlier, their red uniforms and tall black hats creating quite a spectacle on the streets of Washington, D.C. Tourists gathered wherever they went, taking photos and marveling at the pageantry. But to Vance, they represented something else entirely. They were a symbol of the old world, of traditions that had no place in modern America. Sarah Mitchell, Vance's chief of staff, hurried into his office with a stack of briefing papers. She had worked with him since his Senate days and knew his moods better than anyone. Today she could sense something was brewing behind his usually calm exterior. "The British delegation is ready for you, Mr. Vice President," she said, setting the papers on his desk. "The ambassador seems quite pleased with how everything has been arranged. The Royal Guard will be positioned outside the meeting room as per protocol." Vance looked up from his morning coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Actually, Sarah, I've been thinking about that. Why exactly do we need their guards? We have our own security. The Secret Service is more than capable of protecting everyone involved." Sarah paused, sensing the shift in his tone. "Well, sir, it's tradition. When foreign dignitaries visit, especially members of royal families, their personal security details are typically allowed to maintain their protective positions. It's been done this way for decades." "Tradition," Vance repeated, the word hanging in the air like a challenge. "You know, Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about traditions lately, about which ones serve us and which ones simply hold us back." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where he could see the distinctive red uniforms of the Royal Guard members positioned at various points. Their discipline was remarkable, he had to admit. They stood motionless like statues, their eyes scanning constantly for any signs of trouble. "These guards," he continued, "what message do they send? That we need protection from the British? That we can't handle security on our own soil? It doesn't sit right with me." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had seen this look before, usually right before Vance made a decision that would create waves. "Mr. Vice President, perhaps we should discuss this with the State Department first. Protocol exists for good reasons, and changing it suddenly could create diplomatic complications." But Vance was already moving, his mind made up. "No, Sarah. This is exactly the kind of thinking that's been holding America back. We spend too much time worrying about what others think, too much time following their rules instead of making our own." He turned back to face her, his expression resolute. "I want you to call our security team. Tell them that American soil will be protected by American forces today. The Royal Guard can wait outside the building, but they won't be stationed inside during our meeting." "Sir, I really think we should—" "This isn't a discussion, Sarah. This is a decision. The British will understand. If they don't, well, that says more about them than it does about us." As Sarah left the office to carry out his orders, Vance returned to the window. He watched the Royal Guard members, noting their precision and professionalism. Part of him respected their dedication, but a larger part of him saw them as an anachronism, a relic of a time when America had to defer to European powers. The morning progressed quickly, and soon it was time for the meeting. Vance made his way through the corridors of power, greeting staff members and reviewing last-minute details with his advisors. The British delegation had already arrived and was waiting in the Roosevelt Room, a choice that Vance had specifically requested. He wanted them surrounded by American history, by reminders of the nation that had grown beyond its colonial origins. As he approached the meeting room, he could see the Royal Guard members positioned exactly as Sarah had described. 2 guards flanked the entrance, their expressions unreadable beneath the shadows of their tall hats. Their presence was imposing, even dignified, but to Vance it felt like an intrusion. He paused for a moment, studying them. These men had probably trained for years to reach this level of precision. They represented centuries of military tradition, of service to crown and country. But this wasn't their country, and Vance was about to remind everyone of that fact. His security detail chief, Agent Martinez, approached him discreetly. "Mr. Vice President, we've received your instructions regarding the British security arrangements. I have to say, sir, this is irregular. The advance teams from both sides had already coordinated positions." "Irregular doesn't mean wrong, Agent Martinez," Vance replied quietly. "Sometimes irregular is exactly what's needed to make a point. Are your men ready?" "Yes, sir, but I feel I should point out that this could be seen as a breach of diplomatic courtesy." Vance smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Agent Martinez, I didn't come this far to worry about courtesy. I came here to represent American interests, and American interests are best served by American security on American soil." The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone involved could feel the tension building in the air like electricity before a storm. Agent Martinez positioned himself near the entrance to the Roosevelt room, his hand resting casually on his radio. He had served in protective details for over 15 years, working under 3 different administrations, but he had never been asked to remove foreign security forces in the middle of an active diplomatic meeting. The whole situation made him uncomfortable, but orders were orders. The British delegation was already seated around the polished mahogany table, their faces a mixture of anticipation and diplomatic courtesy. Ambassador Thornton, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, was reviewing his notes one final time. Beside him sat Lady Catherine Windsor, a minor royal who had been sent to add weight to the trade negotiations. Outside the room, the 2 Royal Guard members maintained their positions with military precision. Sergeant James Fletcher had been serving in the Royal Guard for 8 years, and this assignment to Washington was the highlight of his career. Standing beside him was Corporal David Hughes, younger and less experienced but equally dedicated to his duty. Neither guard was aware of the storm that was about to break around them. Vance entered the Roosevelt room with confident strides, his security detail flanking him as he approached the table. The British delegation rose to greet him, smiles and handshakes exchanged according to diplomatic protocol. Lady Catherine curtsied slightly, a gesture that Vance acknowledged with a polite nod. "Welcome to Washington," Vance said, his voice carrying just the right amount of warmth to seem genuine. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Quite comfortable, thank you, Mr. Vice President," Ambassador Thornton replied. "We're very much looking forward to discussing the expanded trade opportunities between our nations." As they settled into their seats, Vance glanced toward the doorway where the Royal Guard members were visible. Their red tunics stood out starkly against the neutral tones of the hallway, a splash of foreign tradition in the heart of American government. "Before we begin," Vance said, his tone remaining conversational, "I'd like to make a small adjustment to our security arrangements." Ambassador Thornton looked up from his papers, a slight frown creasing his brow. "Security arrangements? Is there some concern we should be aware of?" "Not a concern, exactly," Vance replied, leaning back in his chair. "More of a preference. I've decided that during our meeting today, American security will handle all protective duties. Your guards are welcome to wait in the lobby area." The room fell silent. Lady Catherine's teacup paused halfway to her lips, and Ambassador Thornton's pen stopped moving across his notepad. The subtle shift in atmosphere was immediate and unmistakable. "I'm sorry," the ambassador said carefully, "but I'm not sure I understand. The Royal Guard accompanying Lady Catherine are here in their official capacity. It's standard protocol." "For a kind of protocol," Vance interrupted gently but with unmistakable firmness. "Yes, I'm familiar with the usual way things are done, but I believe it's time we established some new precedents. After all, we're here to discuss the future of our relationship, not to be bound by the past." Lady Catherine set down her teacup with deliberate precision. Despite her youth and minor status within the royal family, she had been well trained in diplomacy. "Mr. Vice President, the Royal Guard are not merely security personnel. They represent the Crown's presence at these proceedings. Removing them would be unprecedented." "Exactly," Vance said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Unprecedented. Sometimes that's exactly what's needed to move forward." Ambassador Thornton cleared his throat, his diplomatic instincts working overtime, to find a solution that wouldn't create an international incident. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. The guard members are positioned outside the room, not interfering with the proceedings in any way. They're simply not needed, Vance finished. Agent Martinez here and his team are more than capable of ensuring everyone's safety. This is American soil, in an American government building, protected by American security forces. I think it's reasonable to expect that American security takes precedence. The tension in the room was now impossible to ignore. Lady Catherine's diplomatic training was being put to the test as she struggled to find a response that wouldn't escalate the situation further. "Mr. Vice President," she said carefully, "the Royal Guard have served the Crown for over 300 years. They have protected monarchs, foreign dignitaries, and representatives of the realm in countless situations. To suggest they step aside would be asking them to abandon their most fundamental duty." "Their fundamental duty," Vance replied, his voice taking on a harder edge, "should be to respect the sovereignty of the host nation. We're not asking them to abandon anything. We're simply asking them to recognize that their services aren't required in this particular instance." Agent Martinez, who had been listening to the exchange through his earpiece, felt the situation reaching a critical point. His instructions were clear, but the diplomatic implications were far beyond his pay grade. He pressed his radio button and spoke quietly. "Control, this is Martinez. The VP is requesting implementation of the security adjustment we discussed. Please confirm you want us to proceed." The voice that came back through his earpiece was tense, but decisive. "Martinez, you have confirmation from the top. Proceed with the VP's directive." Ambassador Thornton made one final attempt at negotiation. "Mr. Vice President, perhaps we could find a compromise. The guard could move to a less visible position, perhaps in an adjacent corridor." Vance shook his head slowly. "Ambassador, I appreciate your position, but my decision is final. American soil, American security. It's really quite simple." He turned toward the doorway and nodded to Agent Martinez. "Agent, please inform the British security detail of the new arrangements." What happened next would be talked about in diplomatic circles for years to come. Agent Martinez approached the Royal Guard members with evident reluctance, knowing that he was about to set in motion a series of events that would have far-reaching consequences. "Gentlemen," he said quietly to Sergeant Fletcher and Corporal Hughes, "I've been instructed to inform you that your services will not be required during today's meeting. You're asked to relocate to the main lobby area." Sergeant Fletcher's expression remained completely neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. After 8 years of service, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read situations, and he could sense that this wasn't a routine security adjustment. "I'm sorry, sir," Fletcher replied with perfect military courtesy, "but I'm afraid I cannot comply with that request. My orders come directly from Her Majesty's government, and they are to maintain protective oversight of Lady Catherine throughout these proceedings." Agent Martinez had expected this response, but it didn't make his job any easier. "Sergeant, I understand your position, but this directive comes from the highest levels of the American government. I'm asking you to step aside." Fletcher's response would echo through the halls of power in both nations. "Sir, with respect, I answer to the Crown." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down at a medieval tournament. Agent Martinez felt sweat forming on his brow despite the air conditioning. In his 15 years of service, he had dealt with uncooperative individuals, security threats, and diplomatic complications, but he had never faced someone who simply refused to acknowledge his authority with such quiet dignity. Sergeant Fletcher stood perfectly still, his posture unchanged, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was prepared for whatever might come next. Beside him, Corporal Hughes maintained his position as well, taking his cue from his senior officer. Both men had sworn an oath that transcended national boundaries, and they were not about to break it now. Inside the Roosevelt room, the conversation had ground to a halt. Everyone could sense that something significant was happening just outside the door, though the exact details remained unclear. Lady Catherine's face had grown pale, not from fear but from the growing realization that this situation was spiraling far beyond a simple diplomatic disagreement. "Mr. Vice President," Ambassador Thornton said quietly, "perhaps we should pause the proceedings until this matter can be resolved through proper diplomatic channels." But Vance was beyond diplomatic channels now. He had committed to a course of action, and backing down would send the wrong message entirely. Ambassador, the matter is quite simple. This is American territory, and American security protocols will be followed. I'm sure your men will see reason. He pressed a button on the phone beside him, connecting directly to Agent Martinez's radio. Agent, what's the status out there? Martinez's voice came through clearly, though those in the room could detect the tension. Sir, the British personnel are declining to relocate. Declining? Vance's eyebrows rose. Agent Martinez, I gave you a direct order. Are you telling me that foreign security forces are refusing to comply with the directives of the Vice President of the United States? The question was posed loudly enough that everyone in the room could hear it, and more importantly, it was intended to be heard by the Royal Guard members in the hallway. Vance was not just challenging their position, he was challenging their authority to maintain it. Sergeant Fletcher heard every word through the open doorway. His military training had prepared him for many scenarios, but this particular situation fell into uncharted territory. He was representing the crown in a foreign nation, but he was also a guest who should respect the wishes of his hosts. The conflict between these two obligations created a dilemma that no amount of training could fully resolve. Corporal Hughes looked to his sergeant for guidance. At 24 years old, this was his first international assignment, and he had never imagined it would involve a direct confrontation with American officials. His training told him to follow Fletcher's lead, but his instincts warned him that they were walking into dangerous diplomatic waters. Agent Martinez returned to the guards, his radio crackling with additional instructions from his superiors. The situation was being monitored at the highest levels now, and the pressure on everyone involved was mounting rapidly. Gentlemen, Martinez said, his voice carrying more authority than before, I've been instructed to inform you that your continued presence in this area is now considered a security violation. You have one more opportunity to relocate voluntarily. Fletcher's response came without hesitation. Sir, I understand your position and I respect it. However, my oath of service supersedes all other considerations. I cannot and will not abandon my post while Lady Catherine remains in potential danger. Potential danger? Martinez's voice carried a note of incredulity. Sergeant, you're in one of the most secure buildings in America, surrounded by highly trained Secret Service agents. What possible danger could Lady Catherine face? That, sir, is not for me to determine, Fletcher replied. My duty is to ensure her protection regardless of the circumstances. If American security is as capable as you suggest, then surely our presence poses no threat or interference. It was a masterful response, turning the Americans' argument back on itself. If their security was truly superior, why did the presence of 2 additional guards matter? Fletcher had just exposed the weakness in Vance's position without directly challenging anyone's authority. Inside the meeting room, Lady Catherine was beginning to understand the full implications of what was happening. This wasn't just about security protocols or diplomatic courtesy. This was about power, respect, and the delicate balance of international relationships. Vance was using her guards as symbols, making a statement about American sovereignty that went far beyond the immediate situation. Mr. Vice President, she said, her voice carrying more authority than her minor royal status might suggest, I believe there may be some misunderstanding here. The Royal Guard are not questioning American security capabilities. They are simply fulfilling their oath to the Crown. Surely there's room for both forms of protection to coexist. Vance studied her carefully. Despite her youth, Lady Catherine was proving to be more formidable than he had anticipated. But he had come too far to back down now. Lady Catherine, I appreciate your perspective, but this is about more than coexistence. This is about establishing clear lines of authority and respect. On American soil, American authority takes precedence. It's really that simple. Agent Martinez received another transmission through his earpiece, this one carrying an edge of urgency. His superiors were growing impatient with the standoff, and they were beginning to consider more direct action. He approached the guards once more, this time flanked by 2 additional Secret Service agents. The show of force was unmistakable, though still relatively restrained. Sergeant Fletcher, Martinez said formally, this is your final notice. You are ordered to vacate this security zone immediately. Failure to comply will result in your physical removal from the premises. The moment had arrived. Fletcher looked at Corporal Hughes. seeing his own resolve reflected in the younger man's eyes. They had both sworn an oath, and that oath meant something. It meant everything. Fletcher took a single step forward. It was not an aggressive move, nor was it threatening. If anything, it was the opposite. By stepping forward, Fletcher was making himself more vulnerable, not less. He was demonstrating that he was not afraid, that he would not be intimidated, and that his commitment to his duty was absolute. The step was measured, deliberate, and completely calm. But its impact was enormous. In taking that single step forward, Sergeant Fletcher had just escalated the situation beyond anyone's ability to control it quietly. The confrontation was no longer happening in whispers and diplomatic language. It was happening in full view of everyone present, with consequences that would ripple through both governments. Agent Martinez felt his hand move instinctively toward his radio. While the two agents behind him tensed slightly, inside the meeting room every eye was now focused on the doorway, waiting to see what would happen next. The single step had changed everything. The silence that followed Fletcher's step forward seemed to stretch for an eternity, though in reality it lasted only a few seconds. Agent Martinez found himself in the most difficult position of his career, caught between his orders and the growing realization that this situation was about to spiral completely out of control. Fletcher's step had not been a challenge in the traditional sense. He had not raised his voice, made any threatening gestures, or even changed his expression. Instead, he had simply demonstrated his unwillingness to retreat. The step forward was a statement of resolve, a quiet declaration that some principles were worth defending regardless of the consequences. Corporal Hughes, inspired by his sergeant's courage, straightened his shoulders and maintained his position as well. The younger guard was beginning to understand that this moment would define not just this diplomatic meeting, but potentially his entire career. History was being written in real time, and he was part of it. Inside the Roosevelt room, Vance felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had initiated this confrontation with a clear purpose: to establish American authority and demonstrate that the United States would not be bound by outdated diplomatic traditions. But Fletcher's response had transformed the situation into something much more significant. Lady Catherine rose from her chair, her diplomatic training warring with her personal concern for the guards who had been assigned to protect her. She understood better than anyone the impossible position they had been placed in, caught between their oath to the crown and the demands of their American hosts. "Mr. Vice President," she said carefully, "perhaps I could speak with my guards directly? They are, after all, here for my protection. If I were to request that they step aside..." Vance held up a hand to stop her. "Lady Catherine, with respect, this is no longer about your personal preferences. This is about establishing proper protocol and ensuring that American sovereignty is recognized and respected." Ambassador Thornton felt his decades of diplomatic experience screaming warnings at him. He had seen situations like this before, where pride and principle collided in ways that created lasting damage to international relationships. The smart move would be to find a face-saving compromise for everyone involved. But Vance seemed determined to press forward regardless of the consequences. "Mr. Vice President," the ambassador tried once more, "I believe we may be allowing a minor procedural matter to overshadow the important business that brought us here today. Perhaps we could table this discussion and focus on the trade agreements." But Vance was beyond such considerations now. The confrontation had taken on a life of its own, becoming a test of wills that he felt compelled to win. "Ambassador, there's nothing minor about respect for American authority on American soil. This is exactly the kind of issue that needs to be resolved before we can move forward with any meaningful agreements." Agent Martinez received another urgent transmission through his earpiece. His superiors were now monitoring the situation in real time, and the pressure to resolve it was mounting exponentially. Every moment that passed without resolution was a moment that could be interpreted as American weakness or indecision. He approached Fletcher again, this time with obvious reluctance. The respect that had developed between the professional security officers was evident, making the confrontation all the more uncomfortable. "Sergeant," Martinez said quietly, his voice carrying a note of personal regret, "I'm going to have to ask you one final time to stand down. This situation is bigger than both of us now, and it needs to be resolved." Fletcher met his eyes directly. Despite the uniforms and the flags and the political implications, this was ultimately a conversation between two professionals who understood duty and service. Agent Martinez, Fletcher replied with quiet dignity. "I understand your position and I respect it. You're following your orders just as I'm following mine. The difference is that my orders come with a tradition that spans centuries. The Royal Guard has never retreated from its duty, and I will not be the first to break that tradition." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. Fletcher was not just speaking for himself or even for Corporal Hughes. He was speaking for every guardsman who had ever stood post, every soldier who had ever sworn an oath to protect and serve. His refusal to back down was about more than diplomatic protocol. It was about honor itself. Vance, listening to the exchange from inside the meeting room, felt his patience finally snap. He had tried to handle this situation with a degree of diplomatic courtesy, but the Royal Guard's continued defiance was becoming a public embarrassment. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Agent Martinez," he called out loudly, ensuring his voice carried clearly into the hallway. "Remove them, now." The order was unambiguous and final. There would be no more negotiations, no more diplomatic courtesy, and no more opportunities for voluntary compliance. Vance had decided to force the issue regardless of the consequences. Agent Martinez felt his stomach drop. In his years of service, he had removed unruly protesters, detained suspicious individuals, and even arrested people who posed genuine security threats. But he had never been asked to physically remove the official security detail of a foreign government representative during a diplomatic meeting. He looked at Fletcher and Hughes, both of whom remained perfectly still and completely professional, despite the escalating tension. These were not criminals or protesters. These were fellow professionals doing their jobs according to their understanding of their duties. "Sergeant Fletcher," Martinez said formally, "you have been ordered to leave this area. If you do not comply immediately, I will be forced to remove you physically." Fletcher's response was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly in the tense silence. "Agent Martinez, I understand your orders. Please proceed as you see fit." The invitation to use force was delivered with such quiet dignity that it made the entire situation even more uncomfortable. Fletcher was not resisting. He was simply not complying. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and it placed the burden of escalation entirely on the American side. Martinez signaled to his backup agents, who moved into position with obvious reluctance. None of them had signed up for this type of diplomatic incident, but their training and loyalty demanded obedience to orders. As the American agents prepared to physically remove the Royal Guard members, Fletcher made one final gesture that would be remembered long after the trade negotiations were forgotten. He reached up and straightened his tall black hat, adjusted his red tunic, and then stood even straighter than before. He was preparing to be removed with dignity and tact, maintaining his composure and his honor, even as his authority was being challenged in the most direct way possible. It was a masterclass in grace under pressure, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something remarkable. The moment before the agents reached him, Fletcher spoke once more, his words directed not at Martinez or Vance, but at Lady Catherine inside the meeting room. "Your ladyship," he said clearly, "the Royal Guard remains at your service." Then he stood perfectly still and waited for the Americans to make their move. The moment Agent Martinez's hands made contact with Sergeant Fletcher's arm, everything changed. What had been a diplomatic standoff suddenly became an international incident of the highest magnitude. The touch was gentle, almost respectful, but its implications were enormous. For the first time in the Royal Guard's 300-year history, a guardsman was being physically removed from his post by a foreign power. Fletcher did not resist, but neither did he assist. His body remained rigid with military bearing as Martinez and another agent began to guide him away from his position. The Royal Guard sergeant maintained perfect composure, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his face showing no emotion whatsoever. He was being removed from his post, but he would not be broken by it. Corporal Hughes watched in stunned silence as his sergeant was led away. His training told him to maintain his own position, but his instincts screamed at him to act. The young guardsman found himself facing the same impossible choice that Fletcher had confronted, but with even less experience to guide him. Inside the Roosevelt room, Lady Catherine had gone completely pale. The sound of the physical confrontation was clearly audible, and she understood exactly what was happening. Her guards, men sworn to protect her with their lives, were being forcibly removed for doing their jobs. The humiliation was not just personal, it was institutional. "Stop," she said quietly, then louder. "Stop this immediately." Vance turned to face her, his expression showing satisfaction rather than concern. "Lady Catherine, this is simply a security adjustment. Your guards will be perfectly safe and you remain under the protection of American security forces." "Mr. Vice President," she replied, her voice carrying a steel that had not been there before, "you are making a grave mistake. The Royal Guard are not mere security personnel. They represent the Crown itself. What you are doing is not just a violation of diplomatic courtesy, it is an insult to Her Majesty's government." Ambassador Thornton was frantically calculating the diplomatic damage being done with each passing second. Decades of carefully maintained relationships were crumbling in real time, and he could see no way to stop the collapse. "Mr. Vice President," he said urgently, "I must strongly protest this action. The removal of Royal Guard members from their protective duties is unprecedented and will be viewed as a hostile act by Her Majesty's government. I urge you to reconsider before this situation becomes irreversible." But Vance was committed now. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and his only option was to press forward and hope that his bold move would be seen as necessary leadership rather than diplomatic disaster. "Ambassador," he replied firmly, "your protest is noted and rejected. American sovereignty on American soil is not negotiable. Your guards will be treated with courtesy and respect, but they will not be permitted to maintain their positions during this meeting." Outside in the hallway, Agent Martinez was discovering just how difficult it was to remove someone who was not actively resisting but was also not cooperating. Fletcher's passive resistance was making the entire process awkward and undignified for everyone involved. The sergeant was not fighting, but his military training had made his body a perfectly disciplined instrument that would not be easily moved. "Sergeant," Martinez said quietly as they struggled down the hallway, "you're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm offering no resistance." "Agent Martinez," Fletcher replied with perfect accuracy, "I am simply maintaining my bearing as befits a member of Her Majesty's Guard." The distinction was crucial. Fletcher was not resisting arrest because he was not under arrest. He was not fighting removal because he was not a criminal. He was simply maintaining his dignity and his military bearing while being subjected to what he clearly considered an illegal order. Behind them, Corporal Hughes faced his moment of truth. The young guardsman watched as his sergeant disappeared around the corner, leaving him alone to face the remaining American agents. Hughes knew that he could follow Martinez's orders and relocate to the lobby, probably avoiding any further confrontation, but he also knew that Fletcher had set a standard of behavior that demanded matching. Hughes took his own step forward. Like Fletcher before him, the movement was not aggressive or threatening. It was simply a statement of resolve. The young corporal was declaring that he too would not abandon his post voluntarily. If the Americans wanted him moved, they would have to move him themselves. Agent Martinez, returning from escorting Fletcher, saw Hughes's gesture and felt a deep sense of professional frustration. The situation was spiraling further out of control with each passing moment, and there seemed to be no end in sight. "Corporal Hughes," Martinez said wearily, "please don't make this more difficult than it already is." Hughes's response surprised everyone within earshot. "Sir, with respect, Sergeant Fletcher taught me that sometimes the most important thing a soldier can do is make things difficult for those who would compromise his honor." The words were spoken with such quiet conviction that they carried an impact far beyond their simple meaning. This young guardsman, barely out of his teens, was choosing to face the consequences of his convictions rather than take the easy path of compliance. Inside the meeting room, the sounds of the second confrontation were clearly audible. Lady Catherine stood up suddenly, her diplomatic composure finally cracking under the strain of watching her protectors being humiliated. "Enough," she said sharply. "Mr. Vice President, I formally protest this treatment of Her Majesty's representatives. If you continue with this course of action, I will have no choice but to terminate these proceedings immediately and report this incident to Downing Street." Vance met her gaze steadily. "Lady Catherine, you are free to make whatever reports you feel necessary. However, these proceedings will continue under American security protocols or they will not continue at all. The choice is yours." The ultimatum hung in the air like a sword over the entire diplomatic relationship between the two nations. Vance had essentially dared the British to walk away from the trade negotiations rather than submit to his authority, a gamble with potentially enormous economic and political consequences. Ambassador Thornton made one final attempt to salvage the situation. "Mr. Vice President, surely we can find a compromise that respects everyone's concerns. Perhaps if the guards were repositioned rather than removed entirely." "The decision has been made, Ambassador," Vance replied with finality. "American soil, American rules. There will be no further negotiation on this matter." Outside in the hallway, Corporal Hughes was experiencing his own forced removal, though with even greater difficulty than Fletcher had presented. The young guardsman's youth and fitness made him particularly challenging to move, despite his commitment to passive resistance. As the American agent struggled with Hughes, a new complication emerged. Other members of the British diplomatic staff, having heard the commotion, began to gather in the hallway. They watched in stunned silence as American security forces physically removed the Royal Guard members from their posts. Among the observers was Colonel James Whitmore, the military attaché to the British Embassy. Whitmore was a veteran of multiple conflicts and had served with distinction for over 25 years. His presence added another layer of complexity to an already volatile situation. "Agent Martinez," Whitmore said with crisp military authority, "I am Colonel Whitmore, military attaché to Her Majesty's Embassy. What is the meaning of this action?" Martinez, still grappling with Hughes, looked up with obvious frustration. "Colonel, I am acting under direct orders from the Vice President. Your security personnel have been asked to relocate and they have refused to comply." "Refused to comply?" Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Agent, these men are not under American authority. They are representatives of the Crown, acting in their official capacity. You have no jurisdiction over them whatsoever." The confrontation had just taken another turn, with military protocol now clashing directly with security procedures. The situation was becoming increasingly complex, with no clear resolution in sight and the potential for even greater diplomatic damage growing by the minute. Colonel Whitmore's arrival transformed the confrontation from a security matter into a direct military-to-military challenge. Agent Martinez found himself facing not just resistant guards, but a senior British military officer who was questioning his authority in terms that left no room for diplomatic ambiguity. "Agent Martinez," Whitmore continued, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of decades of command, "I am ordering you to release Corporal Hughes immediately. These men are under my authority as representatives of Her Majesty's Armed Forces." Martinez felt the situation slipping completely beyond his control. His earpiece crackled with urgent transmissions from his superiors, who were now monitoring multiple news feeds as word of the incident began to leak to the media. The confrontation that had begun as a simple security adjustment was becoming an international crisis in real time. Inside the Roosevelt Room, Vance could hear the escalating voices in the hallway. Rather than backing down, he seemed energized by the growing opposition. This was exactly the kind of confrontation he had been seeking, a clear demonstration of American resolve in the face of foreign pressure. "Lady Catherine," he said, turning back to the British delegation, "it seems your military attaché is having difficulty understanding American sovereignty. Perhaps you could clarify for him that he is a guest in this building, not a commanding officer." Lady Catherine's response came with ice-cold precision. "Mr. Vice President, Colonel Whitmore is acting within his rights and duties as a representative of Her Majesty's government. What you are witnessing is not a failure to understand sovereignty, but a refusal to accept what amounts to an act of aggression against British personnel." The word aggression hung in the air like a declaration of war. Ambassador Thornton felt his diplomatic career flashing before his eyes as he realized that the situation had moved far beyond anything that could be contained through normal channels. "Mr. Vice President," the ambassador said desperately, "I must formally request that you halt this action immediately. The removal of Royal Guard members from their protective duties constitutes a breach of international law and diplomatic immunity. This incident will have to be reported to the highest levels of both governments." Vance's response shocked everyone in the room. "Report it to whoever you want, Ambassador. America will not apologize for asserting its sovereignty on its own soil. The declaration was essentially a challenge to the entire British government. Vance was not just refusing to back down, he was daring the British to make this confrontation into a full-scale diplomatic incident. Outside in the hallway, Colonel Whitmore had positioned himself directly between the American agents and Corporal Hughes. The military officer's presence had created a physical barrier that the Secret Service agents were reluctant to cross. Removing a young guardsman was one thing. Physically confronting a senior British military officer was something else entirely. "Agent Martinez," Whitmore said calmly, "I am giving you a direct order to cease this action. These men are under my command and protection." "Colonel," Martinez replied with obvious strain, "you have no authority to give orders to American security personnel. I am acting under direct instructions from the Vice President of the United States. And I am acting under the authority of Her Majesty's government," Whitmore shot back. "Your Vice President's authority does not extend to British military personnel operating in their official capacity." The standoff had reached an impasse. Neither side could back down without losing face, and neither side had clear legal authority over the other. The situation had become a test of wills between two nations' representatives, with no obvious path to resolution. At that moment, Sergeant Fletcher reappeared in the hallway. He had been escorted to the lobby as ordered, but the removal of his weapon and equipment had been overlooked in the confusion. Technically, he was still armed and still on duty, even if he was no longer at his assigned post. Fletcher's return changed everything once again. His presence demonstrated that the American action had been ineffective. They had moved him but not neutralized him as a security presence. More importantly, his return showed a level of determination that went beyond simple duty. Fletcher was making a statement that the Royal Guard could not be permanently removed from their obligations. "Sergeant Fletcher," Colonel Whitmore said with obvious relief, "report your status." "Sir," Fletcher replied with perfect military precision, "I was temporarily relocated but received no orders to stand down. I am returning to my assigned duties." Agent Martinez felt his radio exploding with urgent transmissions. His superiors were demanding immediate resolution of the situation, but he was rapidly running out of options. The British personnel were proving to be far more determined and resourceful than anyone had anticipated. Inside the meeting room, Vance realized that his bold gamble was not producing the decisive victory he had expected. Instead of demonstrating American authority, the confrontation was showing the limitations of that authority when faced with determined opposition. Lady Catherine seized the moment of uncertainty. "Mr. Vice President," she said formally, "I am terminating these proceedings effective immediately. The treatment of Her Majesty's representatives has made it impossible to continue with any meaningful negotiations." She stood up and gathered her papers with deliberate precision, her movements conveying both dignity and determination. "Ambassador Thornton, please inform Downing Street that the trade discussions have been suspended due to unacceptable treatment of British personnel by American authorities." Ambassador Thornton felt a mixture of relief and dread as he realized the decision had been taken out of his hands. The diplomatic consequences would be severe, but at least the escalating confrontation would come to an end. "Mr. Vice President," the ambassador said formally, "Lady Catherine has the authority to terminate these proceedings. I will be filing a formal protest with the State Department within the hour." Vance found himself facing the complete collapse of the negotiations he had been sent to conduct. His attempt to demonstrate American strength had instead created a diplomatic disaster that would reverberate through both governments for months to come. In the hallway, the confrontation reached its final moment. Sergeant Fletcher and Corporal Hughes took up their positions flanking the entrance to the Roosevelt Room once again, their bearing unchanged despite everything they had endured. Colonel Whitmore positioned himself behind them, creating a united British front. Agent Martinez received his final transmission of the day: orders to stand down and allow the British personnel to maintain their positions while the delegation departed. The American authorities had decided that the political cost of continuing the confrontation was too high. As the British delegation filed out of the Roosevelt Room, Lady Catherine paused beside the Royal Guard members. "Sergeant Fletcher, Corporal Hughes, thank you for your service today. You have upheld the highest traditions of the Guard." Fletcher's response was barely audible but carried clearly in the sudden quiet. "Ma'am, it was our honor." The simple exchange encapsulated everything that had gone wrong with Vance's approach. He had tried to force submission through authority, but had instead created a demonstration of dignity, honor, and commitment that made his own actions appear petty and short-sighted. As the British delegation left the building, Vance stood alone in the Roosevelt Room, surrounded by the detritus of failed negotiations and damaged relationships. His attempt to assert American sovereignty had instead shown its limitations, and the trade agreements that might have benefited both nations were now indefinitely postponed. The Royal Guard had taken their step forward, and in doing so, they had changed the course of international diplomacy in ways that no one could have predicted. Sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight, and sometimes standing firm in the face of pressure achieves more than any amount of aggressive action ever could. The incident would be studied in diplomatic schools for decades to come, not as an example of successful negotiation, but as a reminder that honor and principle sometimes matter more than political expediency, and that true strength is often demonstrated through restraint rather than force.